The air inside the United Nations General Assembly crackled with a tension no translator could soften. Burkina Faso's president, Ibrahim Traoré, stood tall, his voice steady but thunderous as it rolled through the marble chamber. "You rewrite history," he declared. "You redraw our borders with no right. You flood our lands with debt and influence, then call it aid." Gasps cut through the delegates' rows like splinters. Several diplomats exchanged tight glances. Cameras shifted, zooming in, not just on Traoré's determined eyes, but on one particular American seated in the second row, Karoline Leavitt. She didn't flinch. Wearing a fitted navy blazer and a thin gold cross resting over her collarbone, Karoline leaned forward slightly, elbows on her knees, eyes locked on the speaker. Her face gave away nothing, but her fingers flexed, like they were counting seconds. Traoré continued, "You call us unstable. You sell arms to our enemies, and when we resist, you label us radical. No more. This is Africa speaking back." The room exploded, not with applause, but with the kind of tense shifting that happens when a fault line starts to crack. Behind her, one European delegate whispered, "He's not wrong." Another added, "America won't take that quietly." And she didn't. Karoline stood. Her movement alone turned heads. Some delegates instinctively raised their phones. She didn't even glance at them. Her heels tapped the floor with precision. As she reached the podium, the tension didn't lessen. It thickened. She adjusted the microphone. "Mr. President," she began, "I respect your passion, but passion without precision is just noise. Let's fix that." Then, reaching into her briefcase, she pulled out a rolled-up document, old, yellowed, and frayed at the edges. A hush fell over the chamber. When she unrolled it, placing it flat on the podium, it was a hand-drawn map of West Africa, dated 1885. Gasps turned into murmurs. Someone in the back whispered, "Is that Berlin Conference era?" Karoline nodded once, meeting Traoré's gaze across the room. "You're right," she said. "These lines were drawn without you, but they weren't drawn by me or by anyone alive today. They were drawn by European monarchs with imperial pens, and the rest of us inherited the wreckage." And that was just her opening. The lights in the UN chamber seemed to dim, not literally, but symbolically, as Karoline Leavitt leaned into her rebuttal, her fingers still resting on the faded map like it was a sacred artifact. The silence around her was electric, humming with centuries of tension no speechwriter could tame. "President Traoré," she said calmly, "you are right to be angry. These lines were drawn in backrooms by men who never stepped foot on the land they divided." She paused. "But here's where we part ways." She lifted her gaze toward the delegates. "You say America benefits from colonial legacy. I say we've spent the last century bleeding to fix what Europe broke. While your regime arms militias with Russian rockets, we build roads. While you threaten Western press, we defend it." Traoré raised an eyebrow, lips pressed tight. But he didn't interrupt. Karoline continued, "I'm not here to defend every American policy. I'm not naive. But let's not pretend the instability plaguing your region today is solely the ghost of empire. It's leadership, choices, corruption." The crowd shifted again, this time more uncomfortably. The accusation didn't go unnoticed. A delegate from South Africa whispered, "She's walking a dangerous line." But Karoline didn't blink. From the front row, a New York Times reporter scribbled furiously, already imagining the headline, "MAGA star confronts African president over colonial blame game." Then Traoré stood again, not shouting but calm, deliberate. "You speak of corruption," he said, "but your country backs regimes with oil, with rare earth minerals, while turning a blind eye to democracy. What do you call that?" Karoline smiled, but not with warmth. It was the kind of smile that warned, "Don't mistake civility for weakness." "I call it reality," she replied, "and I face it head-on, not by rewriting history, but by knowing it." She tapped the old map one more time. But history doesn't excuse tyranny, whether from a king, a colonizer, or a modern strongman. The room tensed again. Even Traoré looked caught off guard, not silenced, but studied. Karolina's voice softened just slightly. I didn't bring this map to blame the past. I brought it to remind us how fragile borders are, and how dangerous it is when leaders redraw them with rage instead of reason. The chamber remained frozen, cameras flashing, political lines tightening. One thing was clear. Karoline Leavitt wasn't backing down. As Karoline's final sentence echoed off the marble walls, it didn't vanish. It hung there, thick and sharp, like a shard of glass suspended midair. For a few seconds, no one dared to speak. Even the translators paused, as if unsure how to phrase what had just happened. President Ibrahim Traoré slowly returned to his seat, but his eyes didn't leave Karoline. His hand grazed the edge of his podium, fingers drumming faintly, like a general rethinking the next volley. Then, a delegate from Canada leaned toward the French ambassador and whispered, "She just reframed the debate." The reply, "She didn't reframe it, she hijacked it." Karoline's composure didn't crack, not even when a UN correspondent tweeted in real time. Karoline Leavitt just challenged the post-colonial narrative. With a map and a microphone, UN chamber is stunned. Yuck's UN showdown. It went viral within minutes. Back at her desk, Karoline pulled the microphone closer and addressed the room one more time. It's easy to invoke history when it serves you, harder to lead today without scapegoats. If the West has sins, so do the regimes that replaced it. That drew audible gasps. One from the Cuban delegation, another from Pakistan. Even a Russian advisor shifted uneasily. But Karoline wasn't done. "And let's not forget," she said, voice unwavering, "while you call us neo-colonial, your nations negotiate with China behind closed doors. They promise loans, then seize ports. Who's the colonizer now?" Traoré's jaw tensed. His aides murmured in Dioula behind him. Then, finally, he stood. Again. But this time with no notes, no podium, just his voice. "Miss Leavitt," he said evenly, "you confuse independence with dependency. We don't need lectures from a nation that props up regimes when convenient." Karoline didn't flinch. "And yet," she answered, "you're here in this hall built by American dollars, protected by American troops and live-streamed on American servers. So maybe the lecture is mutual." A low murmur rippled through the chamber. Even the usually unshakable BBC anchor covering the session tilted his head and whispered to his cameraman, "This isn't diplomacy, it's a duel." One of Traoré's advisors gestured toward him, but he waved it off. Karoline folded the old colonial map, slowly and precisely, like folding the flag at a funeral. "This map was drawn without the will of the people," she said. "Let's not repeat that mistake by silencing hard truths today." And then she sat. The room didn't clap, but the silence said enough. As Karoline's final words settled into the chamber's heavy silence, murmurs swelled like an oncoming tide. Traoré returned to his delegation, where a flurry of whispered Dioula and French broke out behind closed lips. One aide scribbled notes furiously, another handed him a dossier labeled U.S. Historical Interventions. Karoline, meanwhile, kept her posture upright, eyes scanning the room like a hawk circling over unmapped terrain. She knew what was coming. The backlash always came. A delegate from Venezuela raised his placard, then spoke without waiting for formal recognition. "Is this now a platform for American political theater?" He pointed directly at Karoline. "Or are we here to build solutions, not ignite another Cold War?" That struck a chord. Traoré leaned into his mic. "Exactly," he said smoothly. "This chamber must not become an echo of old empires." Karoline arched an eyebrow but remained silent. Then the unexpected happened. Germany's envoy requested the floor. A measured, deliberate woman in her 60s, she spoke with quiet conviction. "I don't always agree with Miss Leavitt's methods, but today she raised a necessary point. Colonial legacy is real, but so is modern hypocrisy." The chamber froze again. Even Karoline blinked once, then refocused. CNN's political analyst watching from New York spoke into his panel mic. Did Germany just semi-back Leavitt? This could change the tone of the entire summit. But the heat wasn't over. A sharply dressed member of the African Union stood. His tone was fire wrapped in velvet. We do not take lectures on governance from a country that allowed Flint, Ferguson, and January 6th to happen. Miss Leavitt, check your own house. Karoline responded instantly, but her voice was lower now, controlled. That's fair, she said. America has flaws, deep ones. But acknowledging my country's sins doesn't mean excusing your own. We either hold everyone accountable or no one. Her words were met with tense silence. This wasn't applause territory. It was cold respect. The BBC stream flashed a new headline. Leavitt escalates UN debate. Accountability isn't selective. And somewhere behind her, a camera shutter snapped. Someone captured the moment. She wasn't smiling. But she wasn't retreating either. The chamber had gone from diplomatic to electric. After Karoline Leavitt's stark rebuttal, the atmosphere was no longer formal. It was personal. Delegates leaned in, whispered in groups, and side glances bounced across the room like sparks before a wildfire. President Ibrahim Traoré didn't flinch. Instead, he walked back to the center mic with deliberate calm, his military jacket catching the soft light like steel under glass. Miss Leavitt, he began, you say the world should hold everyone accountable. Let's start with the U.S. in Libya, in Iraq, in Africa, where aid comes with strings that tie our hands. He turned slightly to face the audience. She waves a constitution like it's sacred scripture. But where was that constitution when your CIA funded coups across the continent? The room murmured again, this time louder. Karoline stood slowly. No notes, no papers, just her voice. President Traoré, I don't deny history, but I won't let it be used to excuse present corruption or future violence. You speak of colonial lies. Fine. But let's also talk about how some leaders today silence opposition, imprison journalists, and call it sovereignty. Someone gasped. Another delegate from South Africa nodded, subtly. Cameras zoomed in. CNN, Al Jazeera, and France 24 all posted live clips. Leavitt challenges Traoré on human rights in Africa. Tensions soar. Ibrahim's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. Karoline stepped forward, her tone steady but charged. You want to talk about truth? Let's talk about real people. I met a Burkina Faso refugee last year in Texas. His family fled not from colonizers, but from rebels backed by your inner circle. Boom. The room stilled again. A delegate from Kenya leaned toward a colleague. She's not just playing the American card. She's been doing homework. But Traoré wasn't backing down either. How convenient, he replied, eyes narrow. Your refugee's pain becomes your headline. Then Karoline did something no one expected. She stepped away from the mic and walked toward the central table. She laid down the map again, this time facing the entire chamber. This map doesn't lie, she said. Neither do the satellite images. Aid trucks intercepted, rebels funded, civilians caught in the crossfire. Her finger tapped Burkina Faso. We all have dirty hands, Mr. President, but only some of us are still pretending they're clean. For a moment, just one, Traoré said nothing. And the chamber? Silent as a courtroom before a verdict. Even MSNBC's usual critics admitted in a live tweet, whether you like her or not, Karoline Leavitt just took the gloves off. The silence was brief. Then, like a shaken beehive, the chamber erupted. Half the delegates clapped. Stiff, stunned applause from Western nations. Others turned away, whispering furiously. Journalists darted toward their phones, thumbs blazing across touchscreens. CNN's Chyron, Leavitt exposes rebel links with bold map move. African Union reps exchanged tense looks. The Burkina Faso ambassador was on a secure call within seconds. France 24 cut to a split screen of Karoline and Traoré, captioned, Flashpoint at the UN. Traoré's composed facade cracked ever so slightly. He stepped back to the mic. You bring props, I bring reality. You call out rebels. Do you call out your own country when it drops drones on villages? Or sells arms to every proxy war it can profit from? Karoline didn't blink. I do, and I have, but I'm not the one pretending corruption is a form of independence. A gasp from the back. At that moment, a voice from the balcony rang out. A woman in diplomatic garb from Ghana. Let her finish! The moderator tried to interject, but the energy had shifted. This wasn't just Karoline versus Ibrahim anymore. It was old guard versus new voice. Hashtag number Leavitt vs. Traoré was trending within 15 minutes. Clips of Karoline's map moment had already hit TikTok, with over 1 million views. One popular post read, "That moment Karoline said, 'Your refugee didn't flee colonizers, he fled you.'" Young viewers across the US, Nigeria, and France began uploading reaction videos. A conservative podcast dubbed it "The New Iron Lady versus African Realpolitik." Even Trevor Noah posted a gif of the stare-off with the caption, "This is wilder than the Grammys." Back inside the chamber, Traoré lowered his voice, calm but venomous. "You come here to divide, your politics, your media, your maps. Burkina Faso doesn't need lectures from a political intern with a flag and a filter." Karoline didn't flinch. And Burkina Faso doesn't need leaders who use anti-Westernism to justify oppression. Boom. Even the translator's voice cracked as he repeated her words in French. A delegate from Senegal muttered, "She's not backing down." This just changed the entire summit. Tension hit its peak, but it wasn't over. In that moment, the world didn't see a rising press secretary. They saw a woman holding her own against a head of state and forcing the conversation global. As the session adjourned, the air buzzed with tension like static before a storm. Karoline Leavitt stepped away from the podium, her heart hammering but her stride steady. She passed by delegates still whispering, still watching. Ibrahim Traoré remained at his seat, expression masked. But his inner circle leaned in urgently, already preparing a counter-response. The fallout was immediate. Within hours, while Karoline Traoré was trending in over 20 countries. Fox News ran a headline, "Leavitt schools African leader with UN map drop." Meanwhile, Al Jazeera aired a special titled, "Power and Optics, When Western Conservatives Challenge African Sovereignty." But the internet didn't wait for pundits. One clip, Karoline slamming the folded map on the podium, racked up 3.4 million views in 2 hours. Comments ranged from admiration to outrage. She stood her ground like a lioness. Is she the next Nikki Haley? Why's a MAGA spokesperson stirring up Africa's wounds? On Truth Social, Donald Trump posted, "Karoline just showed the world what strong leadership looks like. Don't mess with her. Don't mess with America." But back in D.C., the reaction was more divided. The State Department issued a statement distancing itself from the event, calling Karoline's remarks not representative of U.S. diplomacy. A senior official anonymously told Politico, "She's not a diplomat, she's a spark plug, and she just lit a fuse in the UN. Karoline, on the other hand, wasn't backing down." In an impromptu press conference outside the U.S. mission, she stood in front of flashing cameras and declared, "The truth doesn't need a title to be spoken. I didn't come here to be diplomatic. I came here to be honest, and if that offends, maybe it needed to." One reporter shouted, "Do you regret confronting President Traoré?" She smiled faintly, then replied, "Only that I didn't do it sooner." A second later, her phone buzzed, a text from her team. "Fox wants you live tonight. CNN's split. You're on every feed." She looked out across the street where a small crowd had gathered, some waving flags, others holding protest signs. But in all the noise, one thing was clear. Karoline had just gone from press secretary to political force. By the next morning, the shockwaves had crossed oceans. President Ibrahim Traoré, back in Burkina Faso, stood behind his presidential podium, his jaw set. What Miss Leavitt said was not diplomacy. It was provocation. he declared in French to national media. "We do not answer to maps drawn by foreign hands. We answer to our people." His words echoed with national pride, but also pressure. Many saw Karoline's display as a direct challenge to the legitimacy of African sovereignty. The African Union issued a cautious statement: "Respect and understanding must guide international discourse." But others in Africa took to social media in droves. The reactions were not one-sided. A popular Togolese blogger tweeted, "Karoline Leavitt said the quiet part out loud, and maybe that's what we needed." In South Africa, a conservative university radio show praised her. "We may not agree with her politics, but we agree with truth. Colonization happened. Ignoring it doesn't change it." Meanwhile, Karoline returned to her hotel room in New York City. The adrenaline had faded, replaced by silence. She sat alone, watching the news cycle spiral into a frenzy. Her team had prepped press hits all day. But Karoline wasn't thinking strategy, she was thinking about her father. He had grown up believing the world changed through quiet work, not confrontation. As a veteran and civil servant, he respected diplomacy until he saw it fail. That night, Karoline called him. He answered with a grunt. "You all right?" She hesitated. "They're saying I went too far." He chuckled. "Good. That means you went far enough." Her shoulders relaxed. Not because it fixed anything, but because it reminded her of who she was fighting for. Not for applause, not for clout, but for a future that didn't cower before fear of being labeled controversial. Outside, protesters and supporters alike had gathered across the street. Placards clashed in the crowd. One read, "Leavitt equals truth." Another, "You don't represent us." Karoline looked down at the map she had unfolded on that UN podium. The crease was still there. So was the line she had drawn. Across it, across the silence, across history. The media war had officially erupted. That night, Karoline Leavitt walked into a CNN panel with the same composure she'd shown at the UN. But the atmosphere had changed. Host Jake Tapper didn't bother with warm-ups. "Karoline," he started, leaning in, "you held up a map in front of world leaders. Some are calling it a stunt. Others are calling it dangerous. Was that your intention?" Karoline adjusted the mic clip to her blazer, her cross necklace catching the light. She didn't flinch. "My intention," she said slowly, "was to remind the world that truth isn't fragile. If a map scares someone more than the policies that shaped it, they should ask themselves why." A hush fell over the panel. Next to her, an African-American scholar from Georgetown shook her head. "But who are you to define truth for another continent's history?" Karoline didn't dodge. "I'm not defining anything. I'm pointing to the record, and if we can't even do that without being accused of aggression, then diplomacy is just theater." The scholar leaned back, frowning. "You're not wrong about colonial scars, but you don't bear them. You just use them." That hit Karoline harder than expected, but she didn't let it show. Jake Tapper pivoted. President Traoré responded, strongly. "Some say you're undermining peace talks. Do you feel responsible?" Karoline's voice sharpened. I feel responsible for saying what others are too careful to, that history shapes power, and silence protects the powerful." Clips of the interview hit social media within minutes. One tweet went viral. "Karoline Leavitt didn't bring a map. She brought the receipts." But not everyone was cheering. The New York Times editorial board labeled her speech reckless. Al Jazeera called it tone-deaf American exceptionalism. Still, invitations poured in, from conservative circles, African reformists, and university forums. Everyone wanted her next move. Her staff urged restraint. "Just let it breathe," one advisor begged. "Don't add fuel." Karoline stared at her phone. An email blinked in bold. BBC debate invitation, London roundtable on post-colonial identity. She looked up. Book the flight. London's sky was gray, the BBC's studio colder than expected, but Karoline Leavitt felt no chill. The room was packed. African historians, European diplomats, British journalists, and seated directly across from her, President Ibrahim Traoré, unexpectedly present via live satellite feed from Ouagadougou. The host gave a brief nod. "Let's begin." The conversation started measured. Panelists spoke of reparations, French military presence, African sovereignty, and global hypocrisy. Karoline listened closely, jotting notes, as Traoré gave a passionate account of Western manipulation in West Africa. But then the moderator turned to her. "Ms. Leavitt, your map went viral. Some called it audacious. Others said it dismissed centuries of pain. How do you respond?" Karoline leaned forward, palms flat on the table, her voice calm, deliberate. "If history hurts, we need to face it, not sanitize it. I didn't hold that map up to dismiss African pain. I held it to expose the geopolitical fingerprints still shaping that pain today." President Traoré, remote but commanding, cut in. "You're an outsider speaking of wounds you do not carry. The West lectures us with charts while withholding justice." Karoline looked directly into the camera. "Mr. President, I didn't lecture. I asked a question. Why are the countries most eager to call out colonialism silent when China builds debt traps in Africa today? Why is French withdrawal framed as freedom, while Russian arms deals go unchecked?" The room tensed. The moderator shifted. "Ms. Leavitt, are you suggesting Africa's current leadership is complicit?" Karoline didn't blink. "I'm suggesting the story of oppression didn't end with flags being lowered. New empires wear different suits." Some panelists applauded quietly. Others shook their heads. Traoré stared silently into the screen. No rebuttal this time. Outside, the BBC crowd buzzed. Piers Morgan tweeted, "Karoline Leavitt just said what the UN wouldn't dare say in 5 decades. CNN posted a furious headline, "Leavitt sparks global rift again." Backstage, her staff was on edge. "You're not just in a debate anymore," her strategist warned. "You're a symbol." Karoline sat still. "Good," she whispered. "Now they're finally paying attention. I didn't come here to flatter institutions or play polite politics. I came here to ask the questions no one else will. Colonialism wasn't just about flags on maps. It was about control over truth. Today, that control wears new clothes, media narratives, diplomatic silence, economic manipulation. And if calling that out makes me controversial, then so be it. President Traoré said I don't carry the wounds of his people. And he's right. But that doesn't mean I can't recognize exploitation when I see it, or call it by its name, no matter who's behind it. This isn't about left or right. It's not about black or white. It's about power, and the people who keep rewriting history to stay in power. The map I held up wasn't just paper, it was proof. And I'm not here to burn bridges. I'm here to light the path forward with truth, even if some can't handle the glare.